The role of climate justice in addressing the global climate crisis. Bridging the gap between developed and developing nations through climate change has become the defining crisis of the 21st century. It is not only an environmental issue, but also a social, economic, and political one. Global warming, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and frequent natural disasters are impacting ecosystems and human societies worldwide. While the entire planet faces these consequences, the impacts are not distributed equally. Developed nations, which have historically contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions, are better equipped to handle the crisis, while developing countries, with minimal historical responsibility, are often the most vulnerable and least prepared. This inequality has given rise to the concept of climate justice, a framework that addresses the ethical dimensions of climate change. Climate justice emphasizes the need to recognize the disproportionate burdens faced by poor and marginalized communities and calls for fair and inclusive solutions that protect the most affected. This essay will explore how climate justice can bridge the gap between developed and developing nations, assess its importance in the global fight against climate change, and recommend strategies for a more equitable approach to climate policy. 1. Understanding climate justice. Climate justice links human rights and development to achieve a human-centered approach to climate action. It recognizes that climate change has uneven social, economic, and health impacts. For instance, rising temperatures may reduce agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa, while causing only minor disruptions in Europe. Coastal flooding might devastate homes in Bangladesh, while affluent nations invest in sea walls and flood barriers. The principle of common but differentiated responsibility (CBDR) first acknowledged in the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) lies at the heart of climate justice. CBDR acknowledges that while all countries are responsible for addressing climate change, their levels of responsibility differ based on historical emissions and capabilities. Developed nations like the United States, the UK, Germany, and Japan have emitted vast quantities of carbon dioxide over centuries of industrialization. In contrast, many developing nations are only now beginning to industrialize and have contributed far less to the problem. Hence, climate justice is about ensuring that those who are least responsible for climate change do not bear its worst consequences. It is also about enabling developing countries to pursue economic growth and poverty reduction while transitioning to low-carbon economies. 2. Historical contributions and present inequities. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, developed nations have contributed over 70% of historical carbon emissions. The United States alone accounts for more than 25% of cumulative CO emissions since the Industrial Revolution, despite representing only about 4% of the global population. On the other hand, countries like Ethiopia, Nepal, or the Democratic Republic of Congo have contributed less than 1% to historical emissions. Yet, these low-emitting countries often suffer disproportionately from climate impacts. Why? Geographic vulnerability. Many developing nations are located in regions prone to climate extremes such as droughts, floods, hurricanes, and heatwaves. Economic dependency. Their economies are heavily reliant on agriculture and natural resources, both of which are climate sensitive. Limited adaptive capacity. Weak infrastructure, limited healthcare, and inadequate governance restrict their ability to cope with disasters. Furthermore, developed countries have more financial and technological resources to protect themselves. They can build flood defenses, invest in green technologies, and recover quickly from natural disasters. Meanwhile, developing countries may struggle for decades to rebuild from a single catastrophic event. This imbalance highlights the moral obligation of the global North to support the global South not as charity, but as part of a just transition. 3. Climate justice in international agreement. The idea of fairness and justice has played a significant role in international climate negotiations, although progress has been slow and often contentious. The Kyoto Protocol 1997. The Kyoto Protocol was the first international treaty that set legally binding emission reduction targets for developed nations. However, developing nations were exempt from binding targets under the CBDR principle. While this was a step toward climate justice, critics argued it lacked enforcement mechanisms and failed to include emerging economies like China and India. The Paris Agreement 2015. The Paris Agreement marked a turning point. Unlike Kyoto, it included all nations, developed and developing, in setting voluntary climate goals, known as Nationally Determined Contributions (NDCs). While this inclusivity was praised, many climate justice advocates noted the risk. Without binding targets or enforcement, richer nations could avoid accountability. However, the Paris Agreement does emphasize the need for financial flows from developed to developing countries. The Green Climate Fund (GCF) was created to support climate adaptation and mitigation efforts in vulnerable nations. Developed countries pledged to mobilize $100 billion annually by 2020. Although actual disbursements have fallen short, the agreement also highlights the loss and damage mechanism to address irreversible climate impacts, such as sea level rise and biodiversity loss. While still under development, it signifies a recognition of the moral responsibility of wealthier nations. 4. Real-world impacts of climate injustice. To understand climate justice in action, let's look at a few real-world examples that illustrate the stark disparities. Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the most climate-vulnerable countries in the world. With over 160 million people packed into a low-lying delta, it faces frequent cyclones, flooding, and sea level rise. Millions risk being displaced within decades. Yet Bangladesh's contribution to global emissions is negligible. Despite this, international support has been limited. In response, Bangladesh has invested in community-based adaptation strategies, such as floating schools and cyclone shelters. While innovative, these efforts are insufficient without international funding and support. Small island developing states. SIDS nations like Tuvalu, the Maldives, and Kiribati face the existential threat of submersion due to rising seas. Despite sounding alarm bells for decades, these nations have often been sidelined in negotiations. Their struggles underscore how global decisions can ignore the voices of the most affected. Indigenous communities. From the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic, indigenous communities protect some of the world's most vital ecosystems. Yet, they are often excluded from policymaking. Many are losing land, access to food, and cultural heritage due to climate disruption, extractive industries, and deforestation, often driven by multinational corporations and distant governments. These cases demonstrate the urgency of moving from rhetoric to action in implementing climate justice. 5. Bridging the gap. Solutions and responsibilities. To bridge the gap between developed and developing countries, climate justice must move from theory into practical policy. Below are several key strategies. Fair climate financing. Developed countries must fulfill and exceed their climate finance pledges. The $100 billion goal is a start, but much more is needed. Funding should be predictable and long-term. Unpredictable aid makes it hard for countries to plan. Accessible. Bureaucratic barriers often prevent the poorest nations from receiving funds. Balanced. Currently, most funding goes to mitigation, reducing emissions rather than adaptation, protecting communities. More emphasis must be placed on adaptation and loss and damage. B. Technology transfer. Green technologies, solar panels, wind turbines, carbon capture must be shared with developing nations. Intellectual property rights should not be used to prevent access. Partnerships, knowledge sharing programs, and regional research centers can help scale climate solutions globally. C. Capacity building. Investment in education, governance, and institutions can help developing countries build climate resilience. Empowering local scientists, engineers, and policymakers ensures sustainable solutions that fit cultural and geographic contexts. D. Inclusive policymaking. Marginal voices, indigenous communities, women, youth must be included in climate decisions. Global and national policies must be designed with input from those on the front lines of the climate crisis. E. Legal avenues and reparations. Some climate justice advocates argue for reparations or compensation from historically polluting nations. Legal cases have already been filed in international courts, demanding accountability. While controversial, these actions push the boundaries of global climate responsibility. 6. Challenges in implementing climate justice. Despite its importance, implementing climate justice faces several obstacles. Political resistance. Some developed countries resist binding climate finance or legal responsibility, fearing domestic backlash. Geopolitical complexity. Not all developing nations are equally poor or vulnerable. For instance, China and India are large emitters but still face poverty and inequality. Greenwashing. Some corporations and governments claim climate leadership while continuing harmful practices. This undermines genuine efforts. Short-term thinking. Politicians often prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term sustainability, especially in democracies with frequent election cycles. Overcoming these